alacrity as she could muster, she exited the store. As promised, she returned with cash in an envelope addressed to Mr. Hancock. In it, she included a note of apology and assured him that it would never happen again. But getting current with Hancock's had taken a huge bite out of her nest egg. She was loaded for bear when Irv came home for supper, but he looked weary to the core, and without her even asking, he undertook the first to-do task on her list. She didn't have the heart to relate the humiliating experience she'd suffered, or to demand an explanation for the embarrassing delinquency. Perhaps he'd bitten off more than he could chew by renting the house. If so, whose fault was that? Hers. Although it wasn't like Irv to be absent-minded, maybe the unpaid account had been a mere oversight. That night she went to bed praying that was the case. However, the next day while he was away working, she entered his sanctum and opened the lidded cardboard box he referred to as his filing cabinet. To her dismay, several recent bills had balances carried over from previous months. How had he gotten them into these straits? When he went out at night, was he gambling? He could have been lying when he denied seeing another woman. Was he supporting a mistress in addition to Laurel? She couldn't tell him how to live his life, but to hell with his pride. She would relieve the financial burden she had become. To supplement Derby's paltry income from the Army while he was overseas, she'd taken a job clerking in a drugstore. She'd enjoyed the sense of purpose and independence employment had given her. But once Derby got back, he'd insisted she resign. He was the breadwinner, he'd said. Taking care of him would be her full-time job, he'd joked. After Pearl was conceived, the issue was never again addressed, not even when he couldn't hold a job for more than weeks, sometimes days at a time. She was not going to give up another home in order to spare a man's ego. If Irv couldn't afford for them to live here on what he earned, then she would subsidize the household income. And not only for the short term, not just long enough to bring their bills current. She must begin thinking long range, to the time when Irv was too old and infirm to provide for her to any extent. She must plan for a future without him, without anybody, because she had resolved never again to hand over the reins of her life to someone else, as she'd done with Derby. She would be self-supporting, thank you. Making that resolution was one thing, implementing it quite another, and she had no time to waste. Days passed, bills piled up. Without Irv's knowledge, she went around to local vendors, paying them out of her nest egg only enough to pacify them and buy herself a little more time. In secret, she began perusing the local newspaper's want ads. She wasn't qualified to teach school. The telephone company had more applications for operators than they had switchboards. Other jobs open to women required secretarial skills, like typewriting and shorthand. She could learn to do both, but not without Irv's knowledge, and she didn't want to raise the subject with him until she had something already in place, giving him no opportunity to argue with her about it. She also began keeping count of the nights he left the house and how long he stayed away. He was entitled to a private life, of course. He was a man, after all. But if he was gambling money away, or spending it on a woman, or women, instead of keeping their household bills current, she had a right to her say-so on the matter. She planned and prepared to follow him at a moment's notice the next time he slipped out the back door. The night arrived. When she heard the back door closing behind him, she hurried downstairs and watched him from the kitchen window as he climbed into his truck and drove away. She rushed outside, frantically cranked up her car, and miraculously, it started the first time. She followed the taillights of Irv's truck, never getting too close. He had repaired the faulty headlight, so she didn't have to worry about a winking one giving her away. Once he cleared the streets of town, he took the familiar highway that led to the shack. Maybe he simply missed his solitude and came out here to be alone. But when they reached the drive leading up to the old place, he drove on past. The farther they got from town, the more uneasy Laurel became. Where on earth was he going? When he turned off the highway, Laurel dropped farther back and switched off her headlights before carefully taking the same turn. But her ploy didn't work. She topped her eyes, and there in the middle of the road was Irv's truck. He was standing in front of the tailgate with his hands on his hips. She pulled to a stop. He walked up to her car, scowling. "Did you think I wouldn't notice I was being followed?"
Where are you going?
"Damn it, Laurel!"
Where are you going?
He stewed, cursed under his breath, then said, "You want to know so bad? Come on, then." He stalked lopsidedly back to his truck, climbed in, and pushed it into low gear. After a couple of miles, he turned onto another road, narrower and more rutted than the previous one. It wound its way between the hills. As they rounded a curve, Laurel saw flickering firelight ahead. Irv pulled his truck off the road and drove cross-country toward the fire. The old truck jounced over the rugged ground, its headlight beams eerily bouncing off stands of cedar trees and rock formations. Laurel, with her teeth clenched to keep them from being jarred loose, followed and pulled up behind him when he braked and killed his engine. He got out of his truck and waited as she picked her way over the rocky ground to join him. He extended his arms from his sides. "Well, satisfied?" She looked beyond him at the glow of the fire.
You camp out here?
"Damn, girl, what do you think? I'm making whiskey." 21. Muttering imprecations, Irv turned and led her toward the contraption, being attended by a man she'd never seen before. As Irv and she approached, he stayed where he was, but stopped what he'd been doing and gaped at the two of them, slack-jawed. He was holding on to a long stick that extended out of a pear-shaped metal vat, the rounded bottom of which was nestled in the center of a man-made stone pit. An opening had been left in the pit's base in order to stoke and fuel the fire smoldering inside it. The fire smoke drifted out of a flue on the back side of the pit and curled up the face of a limestone outcropping, which formed a natural backdrop for the still, which seemed to Laurel to have been haphazardly engineered. "Meet Mr. Ernest Sawyer," Irv said. "Ernie, this is my nosy daughter-in-law, Laurel." The other man let go of the stick and doffed the brim of his newsboy's cap.
Ma'am, I've heard a lot about you.
"Me and Ernie worked together on the railroad," Irv said. "Known and trusted each other for years. He's from Kentucky, knows everything there is to know about making corn liquor. So when I retired, Ernie said to hell with the railroad and quit too. We partnered up."
This is why you've been sneaking out at night?
You thought I was seeing a woman, didn't you?
You're making moonshine?
Good moonshine.
It's illegal!
Her voice echoed off the surrounding hills, making both men cringe. "Pipe down," Irv said. "Sound carries out here. And yes, it's illegal, but it's a living. A damn good one. How do you think I'm affording that rent house?" She was presently too flabbergasted to cite the past due bills. She took in her immediate surroundings, which, by all indications, was a permanent encampment. In addition to the components of the whiskey-making apparatus, a tent had been erected at the edge of the clearing. It was dark in color and camouflaged by cedar boughs. She took a closer look at Ernie Sawyer. He was as thin as a string bean. His overalls hung straight from the shoulder straps, seeming to touch him nowhere else. He wasn't nearly as young as she, but not nearly as old as Irv. He was watching her with misgiving.
You stay out here in the tent, Mr. Sawyer?
Yes, ma'am.
All the time?
Mostly, yes, ma'am. Always when we're doing runs.
Laurel looked to Irv for clarification. A run is the process that starts with cooking the mash and ends with a jug of distilled whiskey. Ernie oversees the making of, I distribute. We split the revenue 50-50. The pride with which he spoke left Laurel at a loss for words. Resuming her survey of the area, she noticed a number of metal barrels lined up.
What's in those?
Mash, fermenting till it's ready to cook.
And all that?
She indicated a pile of what appeared to be building supplies. Materials to make our second still, Irv said. We're duplicating this one, based on Ernie's great-granddaddy's design. It would already be assembled and doubling our production, but I had a list. She let that shot pass without comment.
What about your fix-it business?
A front. Don't get me wrong, I fix plenty. I'm good at it and in demand. But driving around hither and yon, going from job to job, allows me to
distribute your product.
Secret-like. There's a false floor in the bed of the truck. You can't hear the jars clinking together with all my tools rattling around. Plus, I'm old and have a crippled hip.
He plays that up,
remarked Ernie. Irv shot him a dirty look, then said to Laurel, I've got the perfect cover. Still disbelieving, she rubbed her forehead, wet her lips.
It's not only against the law, it's dangerous. A local moonshiner was murdered recently, at his still. I read about it in the newspaper.
Wally Johnson, Irv said with a snort of disdain. The world's better off, believe me.
They's all sorry, them Johnsons, Ernie said. Sorry and mean. We're smart enough not to cross them.
Ernest was befittingly named. He spoke with perfect conviction. However, Laurel questioned his smarts.
Why didn't you set up shop in Kentucky? She asked him. Isn't it known for moonshining?
Irv spoke up ahead of his partner. So's this area. Texas's best-held secret. There's stills all over these parts. He made a broad sweep with his hand. Lot of hills to hide them in. Unlimited cedar and oak for the fires. Cedar gets it to going good. Oak keeps it burning low and even. Hear that gurgle? He angled his head toward the wall of limestone. Natural spring flows out of that. Unlimited supply of cold, clean water, filtered by Mother Nature herself. You gotta have good water to make good shine. He pointed toward a wooden barrel with a spout close to the bottom, which emptied into a glass jug with a funnel acting as a stopper. Ernie's great-granddaddy preached filtering and testing. First filtering makes the whiskey smell and taste better. Testing prevents accidents. Ernie chimed in.
No Sawyer in my branch of the family tree has ever poisoned or blinded nobody. We don't turn out Popskull neither.
Popskull is...
I don't care what it is, Irv,
Laurel snapped, cutting him off. Then she took a deep, calming breath. Her father-in-law and his crony had obviously lost their marbles, to say nothing of their morality. She must make them see reason.
The consequences of what you're doing could be dire.
Dire?
Dire. Who owns this land? Tell me it's not government property?
No, me and Ernie own it. He chose this spot, saying it was as ideal a place for a still as he'd ever seen. The previous owner, a cotton farmer who'd lost 3 crops in 3 years straight to the boll weevil, was happy to get rid of some of his land that wasn't fit to grow nothing. Ernie and me pooled our savings and relieved him of 10 acres. The tract is long and skinny, shaped sort of like a fish hook. He drew one in the air. We're here at the bottom of the bend. The shack is up here on top. She'd never thought to ask about who owned the shack and the plot it was on.
It seems farther than that.
Nope. The road loops and meanders around, but as the crow flies, the shack is just over that hill. Didn't you ever notice the smoke coming from this direction?
I thought it was another house.
She'd had distractions, God knew, but her own gullibility fanned her temper.
You could get caught, Irv.
Haven't yet, and we've been at it going on 5 years.
Yes, but now Prohibition is in effect.
Increasing the demand for whiskey, he said, giving her a shrug that emphasized the practicality. That's why we want to double our production.
You could go to jail.
Not for the first offense. We'd be fined is all. She flung her hand back toward their vehicles.
You drive around in that rattle trap, which is always breaking down. And it's loaded with jars of moonshine? That's begging to be found out.
I stage most of the truck's breakdowns, so all its rattling is convincing. As for being found out, I'm in plain sight every day. People are used to seeing me.
Who do you sell to?
I have a route of regular customers that I keep supplied.
Anyone who buys from you could turn you in.
What kind of damn fool getting corn liquor delivered straight to his door would turn me in? Wives now are another thing. Gotta be careful of them, but that ain't my problem.
Infuriated by the logic of his arguments, she lashed out.
I should turn you in myself.
She pivoted and gave the two of them her back, hugging her elbows to her body. Ernie hissed.
Shit, Irv. Have you gone plumb crazy bringing her out here? I didn't bring her. She followed me,
Irv whispered back. Apparently, both had forgotten how well sound carried. On top of Derby's suicide, on top of Pearl's cruel death, on top of everything, her father-in-law was committing a federal crime with nonchalance and no shame, and for months she had been living off the profits of it, oblivious. Dear God, when would enough be enough? What was she supposed to do about this?
Laurel,
Irv said softly and with hesitation.
Are you gonna...
She raised her hands, fingers spread, in an unspoken but emphatic demand that he not say another word. He fell silent. She looked above at the panoply of stars. There was only a fingernail moon. The sky was very black. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yapped. While living out here in the shack, she'd gotten used to hearing them. Now that she thought about it, it was remarkable how much she had gotten used to in the months she had been here. She was a different person from the woman who had left Sherman, clinging to the fragile hope that Derby and she would be happy together, or at least that their situation would improve. How naive she'd been about love, loyalty, life, about a lot of things. She looked down at the ground, pressed a loose rock deep into the chalky soil with the toe of her shoe, then turned her head and looked back at the still. It was an odd configuration. All the separate parts of it looked crudely assembled, wrongly angled and disjointed. She wandered over and went up the slight incline toward the limestone backdrop, where Ernie had resumed using the long stick to stir the contents of the cooker. Still regarding her with apprehension, he said,
It's just beginning to bubble. We'll be capping her soon.
Laurel peered down into the simmering mixture, then looked over at the empty glass jug sitting on the ground beneath the spout of the barrel, waiting to be filled with a product in huge demand. She thought of the file cabinet full of unpaid bills. She met Ernie's nervous gaze, then turned to Irv. What's the recipe? 22. When Sheriff Amos strolled into the stable late one afternoon, Thatcher was in the center aisle grooming a mare that had been brought to him the day before.
Another bucking bronco?
Bill asked.
No, this one just needs to be taught that it's not up to her when she's ridden. Her owner has to chase her down. She has him trained, not the other way around. I've seen your handbills all over town. They paid off. I've got only one empty stall. Good for you. When you're done there, let's take a walk.
Thatcher lowered the curry comb and looked over at the sheriff, whose grave expression indicated that this wasn't a social call. He asked the first question that came to mind.
Has she been found?
No. Thatcher waited, but when the sheriff didn't expand on that, he said,
Time to quit anyway.
After returning the mare to her stall and putting away the grooming utensils, he walked with Bill toward the bridge. They didn't cross. Instead, the sheriff led him down the grassy embankment to the water's edge. The creek's current was sluggish. Bill removed his hat and fanned his face.
This spot isn't as cool as I thought it would be. Not much of a breeze. Doesn't bother me if it doesn't bother you.
The sheriff turned his head and gave Thatcher several moments of intense scrutiny.
Does anything bother you, Thatcher?
Lots of things.
You don't show it.
Thatcher raised a shoulder, not knowing how else to respond.
What about people's opinion of you?
Thatcher shifted his stance and tilted his head to one side.
One thing that bothers me is for someone to beat around the bush.
All right.
Bill hiked up his gun belt and took a deep breath.
I officially called off the search for Mila Driscoll today. It's been 3 weeks. Volunteers have petered out. I can't spare the manpower to keep up the search. I informed Gabe in person. I promised to hop on any leads that turned up, but I'm not hopeful there'll be any. The case remains open-ended.
Thatcher was quick to catch on to the reason for this visit.
This leaves me the one and only suspect.
The sheriff backed up to a butt-high boulder, propped himself against it, and folded his arms.
I don't think you had anything to do with it, Thatcher. None at all. But people are funny.
It'll be like a shadow of doubt following me around.
I hope not, but people
need somebody to blame.
It's human nature.
Thatcher knew Bill was right. An unsolved mystery was like a sore tooth. It couldn't be left alone. He was the logical solution to this mystery, and no matter what he did, in the back of some folks' minds, he would continue to be. He supposed he could leave town as suddenly as he'd arrived, but that would look like running and only justify suspicion. And where would he go? He could probably be hired on at another ranch, but that would somehow seem disloyal to Mr. Hobson. City life held no allure for him. Wildcatters were actively soliciting for roughnecks to work in the new oil patches, promising good pay. But he'd be living in a men-only camp and doing a dirty and dangerous job. If that lifestyle had held any appeal for him, he would have stayed in the Army. For the time being, staying in Foley was his best option. But he knew the prejudice he would come up against every day, and that rankled.
Damn. There'll always be those who think I'm guilty, won't there?
Until proven otherwise. What do you think happened to her?
What difference does it make?
Venture a guess.
What for?
Why not?
Thatcher hesitated, then squatted down, picked up a rock, bounced it against his palm a few times before pitching it overhanded into the creek. The plop sounded loud in the still air. He squinted up at the sheriff from beneath the brim of his cowboy hat.
My guess? I'd say the doc had her with him when he left the house that night.
The sheriff assumed a contemplative expression.
She wasn't with him at Lefty's, or with him when he made the stop to check on that breech delivery.
Breech delivery?
I haven't mentioned that to you?
Bill explained Dr. Driscoll's second stop that night.
All had gone well, but because of that additional delay, he didn't get back home until after 1 o'clock, when he discovered that Mrs. Driscoll wasn't in their bed where he'd left her.
Nobody can vouch for that.
Except for the old biddy across the street who put Mayor Croft onto you. She says she saw their bedroom light go off around 9:30. That's consistent with what Gabe told me about their bedtime. The light came back on around 10, then went back off only a few minutes later. Eleanor Wise saw him collecting his medical bag from his office. That light went off. He backed his car out of the driveway a few minutes after that.
Is watching other people all that old lady does?
Apparently.
Thatcher looked out across the creek to the opposite bank, where a black and gray striped cat was stalking something in the tall grass.
Did the old lady see the doctor walk from the house and get into his auto?
He keeps it parked around back.
Thatcher brought his gaze back to the sheriff, but he didn't say anything. Bill said,
"You're thinking Mrs. Driscoll was dead and he carried out her body without Eleanor Wise seeing him?"
I'm not accusing anybody of anything.
Understood. We're just talking off the top of our heads here.
Thatcher didn't contradict him, but the truth was, he'd given this a lot of thought. Based on what he knew for fact and not scuttlebutt, He'd dismissed the various theories that had been disproved already or were too outlandish to put stock in. The process of elimination always left Thatcher with only one plausible explanation for Mila Driscoll's disappearance. If she'd died accidentally, Bill said, musing aloud, like if she'd fallen down the stairs, something like that, Gabe would have reported it. If they'd had a quarrel that got out of hand, if he flew off the handle and struck her, a quarrel between them wouldn't have gone that far. Bill's sharp look invited Thatcher to explain why he thought that. He said, when she talked about him, her cheeks turned rosier than normal. A woman in love. A woman who worshipped the ground her husband walked on, Thatcher said. Do you have a lot of experience in that area? Thatcher smiled. No, just wish I had a woman light up when she talked about me like Mrs. Driscoll did when she told me how fond her husband was of her shortbread. I doubt she ever said a cross word to him. But if they did have a squabble, she would have given in early. It would never have reached the boiling point. Looking troubled, the sheriff ran his hand over his mouth and mustache. Here's the thing, Thatcher. If a man kills his wife, it's usually in a fit of passion. Fed up with her nagging about his multiple failures, he loses his temper, and while teaching her a hard lesson in who's boss, he kills her, intentionally or not. Or a husband finds his beloved in bed with another man, goes blind with rage, kills them both. Afterward, he feels either justified for doing it, they had it coming, I'd kill them all over again, or mortified, and he lives out the days till they hang him, eaten up with regret. Of course, some wife killings are plotted. Another woman catches a man's eye, he disposes of the spouse who's blocking his path to greener pastures. Bill paused and took a breath. Over the course of my career, I've seen all that many times. What I haven't seen is a man killing his pregnant wife, his very pregnant, devoted wife, who thought the sun rose and set in him. Not accidentally, not in a burst of violent rage, but with cold calculation. To take her life as well as his unborn child's, to do that with a forethought, would call for a total absence of soul. I just can't feature it. Not wanting to interrupt the sheriff's thought process, Thatcher held his peace. He picked up another rock and tossed it from hand to hand. And anyhow, Bill went on, it couldn't have been premeditated. The doc didn't know he was going to get called away from the house that night. It would help to know the length of time between the emergency call from the roadhouse and his arrival there. More than half an hour, Lefty said. What's it usually take to drive it? Roughly that. Gabe would have had to plan a perfect murder and implement it in a matter of minutes before racing out to treat the young prostitute who got beat up. Thatcher looked at him intuitively. You already asked this Lefty about the timing of the doc's arrival? Bill nodded. So this isn't a sudden notion of yours. It had crossed your mind that the doc had a hand in Mrs. Driscoll's vanishing. Bill's sigh was as good as an admission. He's the one link between Mrs. Driscoll's disappearance and Wally Johnson's homicide. The more I thought about it, the less coincidental it seemed. I thought so all along, Thatcher said. So did I. I just didn't want to say so. Me either. Glumly, Bill added, I wish you'd scoffed at the idea. Doesn't make me feel any better to learn that it had occurred to you, too. Are you going to arrest Driscoll? Without any evidence, no. It's still all speculation. That didn't stop you from arresting me. The sheriff put his hat back on and slapped his thighs as he stood up. I had that coming. You sure as hell did. Thatcher also came to his feet. Cut me some slack. Hauling in a drifter for questioning is one thing. Hauling in a highly respected pillar of the community is another. The sheriff started up the embankment. But I could make it up to you. That is, if you're willing. Willing? When the ground leveled off, the sheriff took advantage of the shade cast by the steel grillwork of the suspension bridge.
I've thought of a way to relieve you of suspicion.
How's that?
I'll deputize you.
Thatcher laughed. Come again?
You heard me. It would be a show of the faith I have in your innocence. If you wore a badge, folks would start looking at you in a different light.
Still amused, Thatcher shook his head. Thanks for the offer and the show of faith, but I don't want to be a lawman.
You've got a natural aptitude for it. You're cool-headed, you listen more than you talk, and you yourself boasted of having a knack for reading people.
In a game of poker,
bluffing at cards is a form of lying. Detecting it is a talent. You'd sense when a witness or suspect was giving me the runaround.
When he saw that Thatcher was about to argue, he held up a hand.
Besides all that, Mrs. Driscoll's fate is eating at you. You want to know what's happened to her.
So does everybody.
But not everybody has a personal stake in solving the mystery. You've dwelled on it.
In my idle time.
Bill grinned. That speaks volumes. I'm headed out to talk again with that woman who had the breech birth. Maybe she'll provide some insight into the doc's frame of mind that night. Why don't you come with me? Listen in. Give it a trial run.
Thatcher shook his head. It won't do you any good to go on about it. I appreciate your trying to improve people's opinion of me, but I don't want to be a deputy. All I know is ranching and horses.
You could still do your horse training. You wouldn't be on staff. Just, every once in a while I could use an extra set of eyes and ears and...
I've seen you shoot. After the blunt statement, he waited a beat.
I count on needing extra firepower soon, because I fear all hell's about to break loose. The Johnsons have sworn vengeance for Wally. I've heard rumblings that they're going to start sniffing out their competitors, and they're going to keep at it until they find and execute Wally's murderer.
How will they know when they've got the right man?
When they've killed all of them.
He couldn't have hammered his point home any harder, and Thatcher felt the impact of it. Nevertheless, he had no aspiration to wear a badge. I hope it doesn't turn into a bloodbath, Bill, but a war between moonshiners isn't my fight, and I'm staying out of it. The sheriff held his gaze for several seconds.
We'll see.
They walked back to the stable together, but said nothing more until they parted there with exchanged goodbyes. As Thatcher watched the sheriff walk away, the words "we'll see" echoed in his head. He wasn't struck by the words themselves so much as by the way Bill had said them. Not with disappointment over being unable to change Thatcher's mind, but with the shrewd confidence that he would. 23. The morning following her discovery of the still, Laurel plunged headfirst into her study of the centuries-old art of making sour mash whiskey. The more product they had to sell, the more money they could make, and the sooner she could settle their outstanding accounts. In addition to the pressing financial necessity propelling her was a personal goal. As long as she was embarking on an illicit business, she wanted to excel at it. Under pain of death, Ernie confided in her his family's recipe for the mash: unsprouted corn kernels, malted barley, water, sugar, yeast, and pottail.
But, he warned, you gotta know how much of each ingredient to add. You gotta know what stage to add it, and it has to be the right temperature. You gotta know when the mash has reached the perfect stage of fermentation. If your mash ain't good, your whiskey ain't gonna be.
How do you know when it's fermented long enough?
When it gets foamy on top. But I dip my finger in and taste it just to be sure.
Many of his instructions went that way.
What's pottail?
Also called slop. It's what's left in the cooker at the end of the run.
And when is the run at an end?
When the liquor breaks at the worm and won't hold a bead. After that, it's distilling less than 100 proof liquor. You stop cooking and pour out the pot tail right then so it won't burn. Hogs love it if you want to use it for feed. Chickens too. But save some to start another batch of mash.
Oh, like sourdough bread.
I reckon. Never heard of that. Is it like cornbread?
She had a lot to learn, beginning with Ernie's vast glossary of moonshining terminology. Thumper, backings, goose eye, pop skull.
That's low-quality shine that gives you headaches for days on end,
Ernie explained. A swab stick was what he'd been using to stir the mash as it had begun to cook. It was different from a stir stick, which had a forked end with a wire strung between the points. That was used to stir the mash as it was fermenting, which usually took 4 to 5 days.
Longer when the weather's cooler.
The referred to worm, she learned, was slang for the copper tubing coiled inside the wooden barrel she'd noticed the night before. The hot vapor created by the cooking mash rose up to the cap and made its way through the cap arm into the worm, where the steam was cooled by circulating water inside the barrel. The condensed result that funneled out of the worm into the container outside the bottom of the barrel was corn liquor. Because of his down-home way of speaking, Laurel's first impression of Ernie was that he was simple. Most would still have that impression of him. In actuality, Ernest Sawyer was a chemist who prided himself on the quality of his product.
You only gotta poison 1 or 2 customers and your business is dead for.
To guard against contaminants or toxins, he held to a rigid standard of filtering their moonshine 3 times before bottling it. Grinning widely, he'd told her,
I'll sample each run by my own self just to be sure.
He walked and talked her through their next run, letting her observe the entire process. She asked a lot of questions. She even took 1 sip of the White Lightning. Ernie and Irv laughed at the face she made. Eyes watering, coughing, she said she would leave them in charge of testing their whiskey's quality. Although she had no intention of taking over the distilling process, she'd wanted to have a rudimentary understanding of the science behind it. Of course, it was also essential to learn how not to get caught. That was a science she must master. One evening, when Irv skipped going out to the still, she brought up her fear of being found out. The 2 of them were seated at the kitchen table, enjoying a coconut meringue pie she had baked earlier that day. Around a bite of pie, he said,
You don't have to be fearful, just careful. There's dyed-in-the-wool abstainers, sure. But a lot of folks around here turn a blind eye to moonshining because they understand the farmer's plight brought on by the boll weevil. They switched from cotton to corn because corn is a boom market. And that's because of whiskey making. It's basic economics.
It's basic crime.
Yeah, well, tell that to a sodbuster trying to keep his kids from going hungry. These people aren't outlaws, Laurel. They're hard-working, poor folk, striking while the iron is hot.
I don't think you take the potential dangers seriously enough, Irv.
All right, I'll admit that things have clamped down since Prohibition. Before it, many lawmen ignored the illegal whiskey trade. Others adhered to, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. They lined their pockets with bribes. Now, though, they're getting squeezed by federal revenue officers and the Texas Rangers.
He raised his fork for emphasis.
That bunch is serious about upholding the law, no matter how unpopular it is. They can muscle their way past local and county officials, clean or crooked. Rumor is, he continued, the Rangers and other agencies are recruiting men to snitch, and typically these snitches are former moonshiners and bootleggers who know the business inside out. They swapped sides in exchange for clemency. Or maybe they found religion and reformed, who knows. What I do know is that it's happening, which is why I was leery of that Hutton when he showed up at the shack, what with our whiskey still being just over the hill. He raised the hair on the back of my neck.
You still suspect him of being one of those snitches?
He looks the type.
What type?
Like Pinkerton agents. I used to see them in depots. Could spot them a mile off. All had the same traits. Polite, quiet, calm, deadly.
Deadly?
One of my regular customers? His boy Roger works for Fred Barker, who has the auto garage and stable just across the bridge from downtown.
That was where Mr. Hutton's handbills said he did his horse training. But she hadn't told Irv about their meeting on the street, so she said,
I know the place.
Well, Roger saw this Hutton, if that's his real name, shoot the head off a rattlesnake poised to strike a deputy sheriff. Faster than a blink, Roger said.
He described the incident to Laurel as it had been told to him.
They were all dumbfounded, none more than Sheriff Amos, who'd been disarmed before he realized what was happening. The deputy had dirty drawers. But Roger claims Hutton took it in stride, never broke a sweat, like he was accustomed to beheading rattlers with one shot from 20 yards, firing a pistol he'd never touched before.
After taking another bite, he'd added,
"This is damn good pie, Laurel. Save some for Ernie."
Of course.
She wished he would elaborate on Thatcher Hutton without her having to prompt him with questions. However, he said no more about him and returned to the topic of avoiding detection. Days ago, she had proposed to her partners that she take over half of Irv's regulars route, giving him more time to work on the new still.
It only makes sense,
she had argued, stressing that she had time on her hands and that the new still was essential to increasing their production. After a lengthy back and forth with the two men, she'd gotten them to agree. But since she was now an active participant, actually transporting the product, Irv seized every opportunity, like tonight, to emphasize how careful she must be to avoid pitfalls.
"Don't make a track that leads off-road. Lawmen look for them. One of Ernie's cousins got caught by creating a trail with his truck that led through the woods straight to his still."
But to get to our still, we have to drive over ground.
"So never turn off at the same place twice. Also, lawmen are on the lookout for anybody buying copper. It's a dead giveaway. I was lucky to sneak in mine for the new still. Bought the copper sheets from an outfit in Weatherford, then smuggled them in on the bottom of my truck."
He had already explained that the purchase of the copper had coincided with their leasing the house. That was why their other bills had gone unpaid. He had planned to make up the temporary shortfall soon by doubling whiskey production. Her list had limited his time to work on it.
You trust the copper seller not to report you?
She asked now.
Irv laughed out loud. "He ain't gonna tell. He's supplying every moonshiner west of Fort Worth. See? The business is good for everybody."
How's the still coming along?
"About finished. Soon's the cap passes Ernie's inspection. He's persnickety about the tapering. Says even before it's sealed during a run, it's gotta fit into the cooker as tight as a..."
Clearing his throat, he'd left the analogy unspoken and simply said the fit had to be airtight. He then circled back to other giveaways.
"Don't be caught with a stockpile of mason jars or sugar. Nobody needs 20 or 30 pounds of sugar at a time unless they're making moonshine."
Where do you buy your supplies?
"From my trusted suppliers, who will remain nameless."
Nameless to me?
"Especially to you, for your own safety as well as theirs. They're making money hand over fist too, but they can't be too obvious about it and jeopardize their legitimate businesses."
They could trust me.
"The system doesn't work that way, Laurel. Their trust in me doesn't rub off on you. You'll have to earn it yourself."
All right, but what's the risk to me?
"Competition for goods is fierce. Men have had knockdown dragouts over bags of Dixie crystals. That might have been what got Wally Johnson killed."
The man who was murdered?
"Gossip is that he hijacked a hay wagon loaded with contraband sugar that was meant for somebody else. I don't know if it's true, but it stands to reason. His family have recently upped their production to meet the demand in Ranger and Breckenridge."
Oil boom towns.
"Yep, populated by hundreds of thirsty men that the Johnsons intend to keep quenched."
Not you, though.
"Hell no," he said. "Those are lucrative markets, all right, but they come with risks Ernie and me aren't willing to take." The men working on those drilling rigs are a tough crowd. They'll shoot each other over a roll of dice, a perceived insult, or a whore. Pardon the mention.
I can hardly take offense, Irv. I'm a moonshiner, in no position to judge how another woman makes her living.
Well, around here, they don't walk the streets like in the boom towns. Mostly they ply their trade at Lefty's.
The roadhouse.
That's why I told you not to go near it. If a man is so inclined, he can take his pleasure in the rooms upstairs, or get skunk drunk in the back room. Lefty's is a regular den of iniquity, a blind tiger.
A what?
He'd explained the term, and she was astonished.
A speakeasy? Here? Where there's a church on every corner?
He snuffled.
Me and Ernie, and every moonshiner around, love nothing better than a tent revival that goes on for days. We raise more spirits selling corn liquor on the parking lot than the preachers raise under the tent. Make more money than what's dropped in the offering plate, too.
They laughed together before he turned solemn again.
When this new still is up and running, I'd like to expand the business. But those boomtowns, no,
he said, shaking his head.
I'm too old for all that rowdiness. And if I was to poach on the Johnsons' territory, they'd cut out my heart and feed it to a mad dog. Just as scary, he went on, are the government agents on the hunt for bootleggers and moonshiners. And it's open season. They patrol every road going in and out of those oil towns, armed to the teeth. More and more of them are getting those new submachine guns. And even if it weren't for the guns, Ernie and me don't have a vehicle fast enough to outrun theirs.
They fell into a ponderous silence, each lost in thought. Laurel picked up a piece of pie crust left on her plate and crumbled it between her finger and thumb. Her mother had taught her the technique of making it flaky. She remembered standing on a footstool in the kitchen, watching as her mother combined the ingredients and added cold water, one drop at a time, until the dough was the perfect consistency to roll out on the floured surface. She often felt a wave of nostalgia for her mother, but never for her father. The condemnation he would heap on his daughter, the moonshiner, perversely deepened her determination to succeed at it.
Tell me more about Lefty's, she said.
It does a brisk business. Folks come from all round.
Who keeps him stocked?
A bootlegger out of Dallas, or so I'm told. He's talked about, but not by name. Lefty also supports the local economy, though.
Laurel raised an inquisitive eyebrow. All Irv said was, Lefty and me have an understanding and do just fine by each other.
Who else does he have an understanding with?
That's his business.
It's our business, Irv. Our bills are caught up, but I don't want to be just caught up. I want to make money, and my stock in trade is moonshine whiskey.
She leaned forward across the table.
Maybe Lefty, what's his last name?
Irv scratched his cheek.
You know, I don't recall ever hearing. It's always just been him and his wife, Gert.
Could Lefty be enticed to buy more from you if you discounted the price per jar?
Jug.
He buys by the jug?
He does, and I'm leaving well enough alone, Missy. We'll make enough profit without taking a baseball bat to a hornet's nest.
He ended on that note, pushing back his chair and announcing that he was beat.
Thanks for the pie. I don't think I've ever had better.
She wished him a good night. He retreated to his bedroom and shut the door, but Laurel was too keyed up to go to bed. Over the course of their lengthy conversation, several things had become crystal clear to her. 1. The new still would double their production, but it was unlikely that Irv's regulars would correspondingly double their consumption, especially under the watchful eyes of their wives. In order for the new still to pay for itself, they must increase their customer base. 2. Ernie's talent was distillation and controlling the quality of their product. Thus far, Irv had proved to be a crafty and capable distributor of it. However, neither thought like an entrepreneur. Growing the business would be her contribution, and she was eager to start. It galled her to think that the Johnsons had a foothold in the boomtowns. But any attempt to compete with cutthroat big-timers like them would be foolish and potentially hazardous. And realistically, neither Irv nor Ernie nor she could make the long and dangerous trips up and back to the oil patch towns hauling hooch. In newspapers, they were portrayed as fertile fields for every form of wickedness. One was either a purveyor of it or a victim, but no one was immune to peril. If the immoral climate and fearsome competition weren't enough cause for trepidation, there were the heavily armed lawmen who couldn't be outrun. Surely there was a safer, saner way to conduct business. But how, when the manufacturing and selling of their product were illegal? These inherent dangers wouldn't abound if they were making and selling hat pins, or sachets, or... She drew focus on the coconut meringue confection in the center of the table. 8 hours later, she was still seated at the table, but the pie had been replaced with the scattered contents of the recipe box her mother had given her when she married. She'd filled sheets of paper with scribbled notes, jotting down ideas as they occurred to her. Various lists had grown longer as the night had stretched into morning.
What the hell's all this?
Not having even noticed that Irv had emerged from his bedroom, dressed and expecting breakfast, Laurel looked at him and declared, "I'm going to need more than 20 or 30 pounds of sugar. A lot more." 24. For days after his discussion with Bill Amos at the creek, Thatcher couldn't shake everything they'd talked about. He accepted that suspicion would shadow him until it was confirmed that someone else had abducted Mrs. Driscoll. His bet was on the doctor. Sheriff Amos was leaning that way too. But Thatcher was no crime solver, and he rejected having to pin on a badge in order to convince skeptics of his innocence. Nevertheless, the specter of suspicion continued to weigh on him. At least on this night, he had something to take his mind off of it for a while. He was going out to dinner. It would be a distraction, but not one he particularly looked forward to. After work, he washed up and changed into a fresh white shirt, dark tie, and his black suit. He'd had it dry cleaned, the tears in his pants and shoulder seams sewn up, and his shoes shined. He put on his fedora. The cracked mirror above the dresser in his room reflected a man who looked like he had a lot on his mind, but one presentable enough to go to supper with Mr. Chester Landry. The shoe salesman's invitation had taken Thatcher off guard. Except for renting rooms in the same boarding house, he and the city slicker from Dallas had nothing in common that Thatcher could see. But when Landry had approached him the night before and invited him to join him for a dinner out, he'd felt obliged to accept. Landry was waiting for him out on the porch. He too was wearing a dark suit, but his bow tie was the color of bile and his satiny vest was striped. Thatcher caught a glimpse of a gold jaw tooth when the salesman smiled in greeting and informed Thatcher that he would drive them to the cafe. As they motored through the streets of Foley, Landry kept the conversation flowing, commenting on aspects of the town and how it compared to others on his sales route. Thatcher wasn't the least bit interested in either women's footwear or the salesman's travels, but he listened attentively and made polite inquiries that encouraged Landry to keep the chit-chat on himself and off Thatcher, which was precisely Thatcher's intention. Most of the locals stuck to the more agrarian schedule with which they'd been reared and tended to eat their larger meal at noon. Consequently, Martin's Cafe wasn't all that crowded at the dinner hour. But parked in front of it was a long black Ford, the most expensive of this year's models. As Landry pulled in beside it, he said, "I see the mayor is dining here tonight."
That's his car?
"It is."
You know him?
"We've met. Chamber of Commerce meeting, I believe it was. I attended as a guest of Mr. Hancock." Seated in the driver's seat of the town car was a man with the bill of a newsboy cap pulled low over his eyes. Thatcher asked,
"Who's that?"
"Mayor Croft's chauffeur," Landry said, adding, tongue-in-cheek,
And if you believe that, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge.
They alighted from Landry's car. As they walked toward the entrance of the cafe, Thatcher got a closer look at Croft's chauffeur. He had bulky shoulders and the face of a boxer who'd gone 1,000 rounds. As Thatcher and Landry reached the door of the cafe, Bernie Croft emerged from it. Upon seeing them, he pulled up short. His eyes sawed between them, lighting on Landry.
Mr. Landry, isn't it?
He stuck out his hand and Landry shook.
Thank you for remembering, Mayor Croft. Allow me to introduce...
I know who he is.
Croft settled a brittle gaze on Thatcher.
Mr. Hutton.
Thatcher tipped his head. Croft hooked his thumbs in the pockets of his vest.
Your companion is well known for his daring-do, Mr. Landry, and his amazing skill with a six-shooter.
Then to Thatcher.
I heard you saved a deputy's life.
A lot of agony, anyway.
Well, splendid marksmanship.
Thanks. Landry stepped in.
What do you recommend from the menu, Mr. Croft?
You can't go wrong with the fried chicken.
He doffed his hat.
Enjoy, gentlemen. Evening.
Landry murmured a response, then entered the cafe. Thatcher followed, but as he stepped inside, he looked over his shoulder to see the chauffeur holding the rear seat door open for Bernie Croft. Both were looking back at him. Clyde Martin was a rotund and cheerful man who took obvious pride in his establishment and its longevity. It had occupied the same corner on Main Street since the turn of the century, serving breakfast through dinner. Salt, pepper, and sugar shakers, along with bottles of ketchup and Tabasco, were kept on the tables. Mr. Martin welcomed the new arrivals personally and ushered them to a table. Thatcher took the chair with its back to the wall, giving him a view of the entire room. This was his habit, but also, from the moment he'd noticed Landry loitering in the dark corner of the boarding house porch, unobtrusively observing the others as he smoked, Thatcher had determined that he would never turn his back to this man. Was it Landry's sly grin and oily manner that put him off? His pomaded hair? Was it the gold tooth tucked into his jaw like a kernel of secret knowledge waiting to be exposed and used to someone's disadvantage? Thatcher also had gotten the sense that he was better acquainted with Bernie Croft than either had let on. Thatcher couldn't specify what it was that caused him to question Landry's integrity, but on matters as important as trust, he relied on his gut. The salesman's friendly overtures toward him seemed a little too polished to be genuine or spontaneous. Now, as Landry cut into his thick slice of fried ham, he said,
I am as tired of the other boarders as I am of Mrs. May's uninspired cooking.
Why do you room there then?
It's cheap, but the company is dull. Their conversation isn't exactly scintillating, is it? Or even interesting.
You seem to get on with Randy all right. He smiled.
He isn't bad company. He can tell a good dirty joke. He's just young.
Outgoing.
Yes, he's gregarious. But underneath all the braggadocio, he's as shallow as this pool of red-eye gravy.
He dipped the slice of meat into it. Unlike you. Thatcher had chosen a T-bone.
Unlike me?
The strong, silent type.
Landry intoned the statement like a stage actor. Thatcher speared a bite of steak and put it in his mouth. His failure to comment didn't deter Landry.
You keep your own counsel, Hutton.
He wagged his fork at Thatcher.
You never give away what's going through your mind.
Usually because it's not worth knowing.
Oh, I doubt that. I seriously do.
He appraised Thatcher as he broke off a piece of dinner roll and spread it with butter.
Tell me about yourself.
Thatcher gave him a sketchy biography, sharing nothing of importance.
Mustered out, was making my way back, wound up here.
Where you got stuck and now plan to stay for a while. Is that about it?
Just taking it one day at a time.
A man with no plan.
In the trenches, I saw men die in mid-sentence. Planning your next breath is a wasted effort.
Strong, silent, and a philosopher. Flashing the wily grin that instilled Thatcher with dislike as well as mistrust, Chester held his stare a beat longer, then continued eating. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair, patted his stomach, and sighed with contentment. Must say that was tasty. I'll have to trust the mayor's endorsement and try the fried chicken next time. Have you had a hamburger at Lefty's? The salesman cocked his head. Lefty's? It's a roadhouse, out a ways. I've heard the burgers are worth the drive. Thatcher couldn't say what had prompted him to drop a mention of the roadhouse into the conversation. It had been a gambit, like placing a large opening bid only to see how the other player at the table would react. Chester Landry didn't take the bait. He gave a of disinterest and signaled to Mr. Martin that they were finished. Thatcher noticed that they were the only two diners remaining. They passed on dessert but ordered coffee. As Mr. Martin served it, he said, "Take your time, gentlemen. There's plenty in the pot for a refill." Thatcher sipped his coffee, piping hot and black. Landry added cream and sugar to his and stirred it for longer than necessary. When he lifted the spoon from the cup, he clinked it against the rim several times. He said, "It's such a shame that you were associated with the investigation into the missing woman. That couldn't have been a pleasant experience." "It didn't last long." "Even so." Thatcher sipped his coffee, saying nothing, hoping the subject would die. Landry wagged his spoon just as he had his fork earlier. "See, Hutton, that's what I'm talking about. Most men would be furious, railing at the sheriff, at everybody who would listen about the unfairness of your detention. You act unaffected. But I wonder if behind the steely veneer you're seething, or are you truly this slow to rile?" Before Thatcher could answer, motion toward the back of the cafe drew his attention. The swinging door into the kitchen was being pushed open by Laurel Plummer, by Laurel Plummer's bottom, her very shapely bottom. She was attempting to wedge through the door with both hands raised, each supporting what looked like a baking dish draped in a dish towel. It was a precarious balancing act. In an instant, Thatcher was out of his chair. Mr. Martin was late to respond because he'd been behind the counter, matching the day's receipts with the money in his till. Thatcher pulled wide the door. "Thank you, Mr. Martin," she said as she was turning. "I shouldn't have tried to—" She came to an abrupt stop and blinked up at Thatcher. Several seconds passed without either of them speaking. Then she mumbled a thank you and sidestepped to go around him. He reached for the dish in her left hand. "Let me take this one." "No, thank you. I've got them." Mr. Martin rushed around the end of the counter. "Mrs. Plummer, forgive me. My people working in back were supposed to tell me when you got here." "It's quite all right. They were busy." She took a breath and gave a shaky smile. "As ordered, a pecan pie and a peach cobbler." She handed them to Mr. Martin in turn. He set the baked goods side by side on the counter and whisked off the muslin towels with the flourish of a magician over a top hat. "Ah, they look scrumptious. Beautiful, too. My wife, God rest her soul, always got the crust too brown." Laurel looked pleased but self-conscious over the compliment. "I hope your customers approve." "I've got two gents here now who turned down dessert, but I'll bet they'll reconsider." He winked at her. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Plummer has started baking for me, and her pies are out of this world. The cobbler is still warm. Can I tempt you? I'll add a scoop of ice cream on the house." "You've sold me," Chester Landry said. He had pushed away from the table and was standing with his napkin in his hand. "Mrs. Plummer, Chester Landry." He touched his chest and gave her a nod. "How do you do?" "Actually, I regretted that my dinner partner— Oh, forgive me. This is Mr. Thatcher Hutton." The introduction required her to acknowledge him again, something she had avoided doing since her stunned reaction to another unexpected meeting with him. Having recovered, she now said coolly, "Mr. Hutton." Mrs. Plummer?"
Landry said, "As I was saying, to my disappointment, Mr. Hutton had declined dessert, so I felt compelled to do likewise. Thank you for coming to my rescue."
I hope you enjoy the cobbler.
Landry pulled an empty chair from beneath the table. "Would you care to join us?"
No.
Then, as though realizing how curtly she'd answered, she added,
I can't. I have other deliveries to make.
She turned back to Mr. Martin and spoke to him in an undertone. Thatcher didn't catch her words, but Martin said, of course," and bustled back around the counter to the cash register. Laurel meticulously folded the dish towels and tucked them beneath her arm. When Mr. Martin returned to her, she extended her hand, and he counted out bills into her palm. She slipped the money into a pocket of her skirt.
Do you want to place an order for Thursday, Mr. Martin?
Can you do another apple? And people are still raving about the lemon meringue.
I could make another lemon, of course.
Although, she dragged out the word, capturing the cafe owner's attention.
I also do a chocolate meringue.
1 apple, 1 lemon, 1 chocolate.
She reached across the counter to shake his hand.
Thank you. I'll see you before closing on Thursday.
She turned and gave Chester Landry a nod, which looked token to Thatcher. He outdistanced her to the swinging door and pulled it open for her.
I'll walk you out.
No, thank you. I'm in a hurry.
He suspected her of fibbing about having more deliveries to make, but there was no way to gracefully call her on it. Then, good night, Mrs. Plummer.
Good night.
He watched her wend her way through the kitchen, where 2 women were washing dishes, and a man was chopping up raw chickens. After Laurel disappeared through the rear exit, Thatcher let the door swing shut. Mr. Martin was behind the counter, spooning Landry's cobbler into a bowl. Landry himself had remained standing, his hand on the back of his chair, smarmy smile in place. Thatcher walked over and resumed his seat. As Landry sat down, he said, "I was wrong."
About what?
Thatcher sipped his cold coffee. "One sometimes can guess what's going through your mind." He cocked an eyebrow in a one-man-to-another leer. Thatcher gave him a long, unwavering stare from which most men would back down. Landry's grin only widened enough to reveal his gold tooth. Thatcher badly wanted to knock it out. Instead, he called over to Mr. Martin.
"I'll have a slice of the pecan pie, please. No ice cream."
His attempt to deflect Landry's interest only seemed to amuse the man more. But the salesman didn't pursue the subject of Laurel Plummer. Instead, he asked Thatcher about his horse training technique. Each bite of the rich pie melted in Thatcher's mouth. As they left the cafe, Thatcher declined the ride back to the boarding house.
"I need to stretch my legs. I'm going to walk back."
Giving Landry no opportunity